Title: The Unspoken Oath. Chapter 1: The Promise of Shadows. The small town of Oakwood Hollow had always felt like a forgotten relic, tucked away between the steep hills and dense dark woods. To an outsider, it would seem quaint, peaceful even. Its cobblestone streets were always quiet, save for the occasional rattle of an old cart. And the homes, all neat and orderly, painted in pastel hues, seemed straight out of a painting. But there was a pervasive feeling here, one that slipped into your bones like a chill, a sense of being watched, of never being truly alone. Jonah, a man in his early 30s, had been to many places, seen many things in his time. He had moved between cities, shifting from one temporary home to another, running away from his own shadows. But this place, this desolate, aching corner of the world, was different. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the earth itself was burdened with some ancient secret it had no intention of ever sharing. Arriving at the inn late in the evening, he had seen nothing of the town other than the glistening wet streets beneath a moonless sky. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with thin, brittle hair and a hunched back, had greeted him without a word. There was something strange in her gaze, something old and knowing that lingered too long on his face before she handed him a rusty key and muttered, "Room 4. Keep to yourself, boy. This town has its stories. Be careful what promises you make." Jonah had laughed it off, not knowing whether to find it ominous or simply a product of her age. He took the key and climbed the narrow staircase to his room, his boots echoing in the silence. The room itself was small, with a single window that looked out over the town square. The moon, hidden behind a veil of clouds, cast no light into the room. The bed was hard, the sheets cold, and yet the moment he lay down, Jonah felt an overwhelming urge to close his eyes. Sleep. He hadn't realized how exhausted he truly was until his head hit the pillow. As he drifted into slumber, the soft creak of the floorboards below seemed to whisper, like someone or something was waiting just out of view. Jonah woke suddenly. It wasn't the loud ringing of an alarm clock or the shrill sound of a telephone that jarred him from his sleep, but a sense of suffocating dread. The air in the room had thickened, the quiet hum of the world outside distorted. The space around him seemed wrong. The room was no longer bathed in the soft, comforting darkness he had fallen asleep in. Instead, it was shadowed, stretched by an unnatural flickering light. His heart raced as his eyes darted to the window. Someone was standing just outside. The figure was tall, nearly skeletal, with limbs that seemed far too long for the frame it inhabited. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood, but there was an unmistakable presence to it. Jonah could feel the figure's eyes on him, even though he couldn't see them. A cold gust of wind blew through the cracks in the window, rattling the glass as the figure raised one hand, motioning for Jonah to come closer. It wasn't a command, nor a demand. It was an invitation, and yet it filled Jonah with the most paralyzing fear. He wanted to move, to get up, to lock the window, but his body refused to obey. His limbs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by some invisible force. The figure outside stepped forward, each movement deliberate, each step a slow, haunting approach toward him. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The presence of the figure was so oppressive that he could no longer distinguish between the physical and the spectral. The boundaries of the room felt thin, fragile, as though they could collapse at any moment. He closed his eyes, trying to force the fear from his chest, trying to wake from this nightmare. But when he opened them again, the figure was gone. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting pale beams over the room. Jonah's breath came in shallow gasps, his body covered in a thin sheen of sweat. The cold had gone, leaving only a lingering sense of unease that gnawed at him. He blinked several times, disoriented, trying to piece together the fragments of what had just occurred. Had it been a dream? It felt too real, too vivid. The memory of the figure, the hooded shape and its outstretched hand, was etched into his mind. Jonah tried to push the feeling away. He needed to clear his head, to leave the confines of the room. So, he forced himself to his feet. his legs trembling with the aftershocks of sleep, and left the inn. The streets of Oakwood Hollow were eerily quiet in the morning light. The shops were shuttered, and the town square was devoid of people. There was no one around, no children playing, no vendors calling out their wares, no sounds of life at all. As Jonah walked down the main street, a small, dilapidated shop caught his eye. A curiosity shop, perhaps, or a place where antiques were sold. He found himself drawn toward it, a force pulling him without conscious thought. He reached for the handle and entered. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The shelves were lined with strange artifacts, old dolls with glassy eyes, tarnished mirrors, jars filled with blackened liquids, and books bound in worn leather. But what caught Jonah's attention was the glass case sitting at the far end of the room, the one that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. In the case was an object, a key. It was small and ornate, with intricate carvings etched into the brass. It shimmered faintly, as though it held some kind of secret. Jonah couldn't take his eyes off it, feeling a strange pull within him, as if the key had been waiting for him all along. "Ah, you found it," said a voice from behind him. Jonah turned quickly, startled. The shopkeeper was a thin man, with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes. His voice was low, his tone unsettling, as if he had been waiting for Jonah's arrival for a long time. "That key," the man continued, "belongs to someone who made a promise, a very important one, a promise that binds them, for better or worse." Jonah's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the cold, metallic weight of the key drawing him closer. "Do you know its significance?" the man asked, his voice laced with something Jonah couldn't quite place. Jonah swallowed hard, the chill creeping back into his spine. "No, I don't." The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed. "It's a promise that can never be broken. Not by you. Not by anyone." Chapter 2. The Whispering Shadows. Jonah awoke the next morning with the feeling of dread still clinging to him, the remnants of his nightmare still fresh in his mind. His chest ached with the weight of something he couldn't comprehend, like the world had shifted overnight, and he had been left behind, unaware of the forces stirring just out of sight. The room was still and quiet, the sunlight creeping through the curtains in soft, muted beams. The key lay on his nightstand, gleaming innocently in the soft morning light. He reached for it without thinking, fingers brushing the cold metal, and an immediate shiver ran up his spine. It felt heavier now, as though it had gained a weight beyond its physical form. The engravings on its surface had deepened, almost as if they were alive. Jonah recoiled instinctively, but the pull inside him was undeniable. He had to hold it. He didn't understand why, but the urge was overwhelming. The nightmare from last night replayed in his mind, the voice of the figure, the promise that had bound him. He couldn't remember ever making such a vow, but the certainty in the figure's voice was undeniable. The promise was real. He was bound to it, to whatever it was that the key had awakened. For a moment, Jonah thought about returning the key to the shop. It seemed like the only rational thing to do, the only way to undo the terror that had gripped his soul. But something stopped him. Something deep within him whispered that it was already too late. The promise had been made, and breaking it would only bring worse consequences. A knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. His breath hitched, and his hand gripped the key even tighter. It was as if the presence from his dream had slipped into reality. He hesitated, his heart thudding in his chest as he turned towards the door. His mind raced, wondering who it could be. There was no reason anyone should be here. His apartment was tucked away, far from any main roads or populated areas. Yet, someone was knocking, persistent, patient. "Jonah, it's Sarah," a soft voice called through the door. "I brought you some coffee." Sarah. His mind cleared momentarily. She was one of his only friends, though they hadn't spoken much recently. She worked at a nearby cafe and often checked in on him when he seemed to be avoiding the world. Jonah felt a strange mix of relief and unease at the sound of her voice. She had no idea what was happening to him. How could she? His hand trembled as he set the key back down on the nightstand, unsure if it was the right decision. Something about Sarah's visit didn't feel right. The air in the apartment seemed to thicken, the shadows creeping just a little too far into the room, stretching across the walls in unnatural ways. But the knock persisted, and Jonah had to force himself to his feet. He couldn't just hide from everything. He opened the door to find Sarah standing there, holding a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a smile on her face. But it was a strange smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Something was wrong. The air around her felt heavy, as if the world had shifted slightly, just enough to make her presence seem off. "Morning," Sarah said, her voice sweet but distant. "I thought you could use a pick-me-up." Jonah hesitated, his gaze flicking to the cup in her hand. The scent of the coffee was rich and warm, but there was something unsettling about it, something he couldn't quite place. He took the cup from her, but the moment his fingers brushed against hers, a cold sensation ran up his arm, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Thanks," Jonah muttered, trying to shake the feeling. "I appreciate it." Sarah's smile widened slightly, but there was an odd, unsettling quality to it now. "No problem," she said, her voice almost too sweet. "I just wanted to check on you. You've seemed a little off lately. Is everything all right?" Jonah's throat went dry. He wanted to tell her the truth, to explain everything, the nightmares, the key, the presence that seemed to haunt him. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. What could he possibly say? How could anyone understand? "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, you know. Work's been draining." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, as though she didn't believe him, but she didn't press further. Instead, she stepped past him into the apartment, her footsteps unnervingly soft. Jonah swallowed the growing unease in his chest and closed the door behind her. "How's the coffee?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. Jonah hesitated, lifting the cup to his lips. As the dark liquid touched his tongue, a wave of nausea surged through him. The taste was off, bitter, metallic, as though something was wrong with it. He set the cup down on the table, the tremor in his hand more noticeable now. "It's fine," Jonah lied, trying to ignore the sensation of something crawling under his skin. "I've just been a little distracted lately." Sarah nodded, her gaze lingering on him in a way that made him uncomfortable. She was quiet for a moment, her lips pressed together as if considering something. Then, without warning, her eyes flicked to the nightstand, where the key lay. Jonah felt his heart skip a beat. He had forgotten about the key's presence in the room. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying the object. "What's that?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an edge. Jonah's pulse quickened, a sense of panic flooding his chest. The key, how could he have been so careless? He had hoped Sarah wouldn't notice it, but there it was, unmistakable, resting in plain view. "It's nothing," Jonah said quickly, stepping forward and placing his hand over the key, as though that would somehow erase it from her sight. "Just a keepsake. Nothing important." But Sarah's eyes were fixed on it, her expression now unreadable. "Are you sure about that? It doesn't look like nothing." She took a slow step forward, her movements deliberate. Jonah felt his breath catch in his throat. He didn't want to talk about the key, didn't want to explain the promises it held, or the dark forces that were now tied to it. But the weight of her gaze made it impossible to look away. "Please," he whispered, his voice strained. "Just drop it. It's not what you think." For a moment, Sarah said nothing. Then, without warning, she reached out and picked up the key. Jonah's heart stopped. The moment Sarah's fingers touched the cold metal, a shudder ran through the apartment. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, growing larger, darker. The temperature dropped sharply. Jonah could feel it, feel the change in the air, as if something had been awakened by the mere touch of the key. Sarah looked down at the key in her hand, her face expressionless, but her eyes were wide, as though she was seeing something Jonah couldn't, something that shouldn't be. She gasped, her voice faltering as she took a step back, the key slipping from her hand and falling to the floor with a soft clink. The room was silent. Jonah stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to get out, to run far away from everything that was happening. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, coiling like snakes, wrapping around them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Sarah spoke again. "You shouldn't have taken it, Jonah." Chapter 3. The Echoes of Promises, Part 2. Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that the key was more than just an object. It wasn't just brass or metal. It felt like a tangible thread, pulling him into something darker, something ancient. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky outside his window took on a bruised hue, darkening far quicker than it should have. The oppressive weight of the town's silence pressed in, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He had left the shop earlier, the strange words of the shopkeeper still echoing in his mind, but they made no sense. How could a promise bind him? What could it mean? Yet he knew in his bones that something had shifted in him the moment he touched that key. That night, the world felt different, like the very fabric of reality was fraying at the edges. Jonah lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch and writhe, as if alive, though he could never quite see them move. His mind raced through fragments of thoughts, doubts, and questions. The figure outside the window, the unsettling feeling in the air, the shopkeeper's cryptic words. They all wove together into something Jonah didn't want to understand, but couldn't escape. His eyes drifted to the nightstand. The key lay there, innocently resting in the dim light. Its carved details seemed sharper now, as though they were drawing him in with every passing moment. Jonah reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against it. The cold metal sent a jolt through him, an electric shock that snapped him fully awake. The room around him seemed to distort, the walls stretching as though the space was being warped. He heard the creak of floorboards, the faint murmur of whispers, a language he couldn't understand. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm of it quick and uneven, as though it too was caught in the grip of something foreign. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. An icy gust of wind, unbidden and unnatural, rushed through the room, snuffing out the candle by his bedside. The shadows in the corners seemed to gather, growing larger and darker, taking form. Jonah could feel them closing in, their presence thickening the air until it became suffocating. Then, a voice, low and guttural, as if from the depths of some forgotten grave, it whispered his name. Jonah. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, curling into his ears from all directions. The figure, the one he had seen earlier, appeared again, this time within the room itself. It was no longer a distant silhouette outside his window. It stood before him, towering and implacable. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but Jonah could feel its gaze, burning into him like a brand. The key in his hand grew colder, colder than anything he had ever touched, as though it was pulling the warmth from his very skin. "Do you know what you've done, Jonah?" the voice rasped. It was neither man nor woman, young nor old. It was timeless, bound by something deeper than age. "You've taken something that was never meant for you." Jonah's voice was a croak, barely audible as he struggled to speak. I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The figure stepped forward, each movement deliberate as though it was savoring his terror. It reached out with a skeletal hand, its long pale fingers brushing his forehead. The touch was freezing, like death itself was pressing down on him. "You made a promise," it said softly, the words carrying a weight that seemed to crush the air around him. "A promise that cannot be broken, no matter how hard you try." Jonah felt his throat tighten, panic rising in his chest. "I haven't made any promises," he whispered desperately. "I don't even know what you're talking about." The figure tilted its head, as though considering his words. Then it laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that filled the room like the wind howling through an empty graveyard. "You made a promise when you touched the key," it murmured. "You took it from the shop. You felt it call to you. The key binds you, Jonah. It binds you to me." Jonah's mind spun, the room spinning with it. The walls closed in further, the shadows seeming to pulse with an unnatural life. The key, the figure, the whispered words, all of it was suffocating him. He tried to scream, but no sound emerged from his throat. His body was frozen, caught in the grip of something far more powerful than anything he had ever known. "You will never be free of me," the figure continued, its voice a whisper, yet it filled every corner of the room. "The promise is already made. The key cannot be returned. You are bound to me now, Jonah. For eternity." The air grew colder still, and Jonah could feel himself slipping, losing grip on the reality around him. He wanted to tear away from the figure, to run, to escape, but his body wouldn't obey. The key seemed to burn against his palm, and the room warped around him. The shadows thickened, and in the dark corners of the room he could see flickering shapes, human, yet not, faces with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. The figure's voice, now more insistent, broke through the thickening darkness. "You made the promise, Jonah. You agreed to the price, and now you must pay." Outside the window, the winds howled as the sky turned an unnatural shade of red. The trees in the distance swayed violently, their branches scraping against each other like the bones of long-forgotten corpses. And somewhere, deep in the woods, something was waiting, something ancient. Jonah awoke with a sharp gasp, his body drenched in sweat, his pulse hammered in his ears, his heart racing as if it had been in the grip of something unspeakable. The room around him was still, silent. The oppressive weight of the figure was gone, but the fear lingered. His fingers clenched around the key. It was warm again, like it had never been cold at all. He had to get out of this place. He couldn't stay here. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was pointless. The key had already done its work. He was trapped, bound, no escape. He could hear it now, whispers, soft at first, then louder, growing clearer. The whispers of the promise he had made. Chapter 4. The Echo of Silence. The key had always been there, waiting for him, as though it had been a part of him from the beginning. Every step Jonah took toward it felt like a step closer to a dark truth, one he didn't want to uncover but couldn't ignore. There was a force in the room, subtle yet immense, stretching across the walls, creeping beneath the floorboards, hovering in the corners of the room like some forgotten god. The air itself was heavier, pressing against his lungs, as if something ancient and unseen was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. After Sarah had left, the room remained unchanged, yet it didn't. The key, now lying innocently on the nightstand, seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. Jonah sat on the edge of his bed, hands trembling, staring at it as though it were alive, its metallic sheen glinting in the dim light. The apartment felt claustrophobic, its walls closing in on him with each passing second. He had no explanation for what was happening. His mind kept replaying Sarah's last words. "You shouldn't have taken it, Jonah." What did she mean by that? He didn't understand, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the key had started all of this, and now he was in too deep to turn back. His thoughts swirled in a haze of confusion and fear. He needed answers, but where could he go? To whom could he turn? His fingers reached out, hesitant, but the pull of the key was undeniable. It was as though it were calling him, beckoning him to reach out and claim its power. Jonah stood, every movement feeling sluggish and unnatural, as if his body wasn't entirely his own anymore. He approached the nightstand slowly, each step echoing like a drumbeat in his ears. When his fingers brushed the cool surface of the key, a sharp jolt shot up his spine, a sensation so intense it made his knees buckle slightly. He grabbed it. The moment he did, the apartment around him seemed to warp. The shadows deepened. The air grew colder. A low, guttural sound filled the room, like distant whispering, an unintelligible murmur that scraped at his thoughts. Jonah's heart raced, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Something was wrong, horribly, terribly wrong. And then it began. The walls around him began to groan, not as if from old age, but as though they were alive. The floor creaked, the ceiling shifted, and the once familiar apartment seemed to tremble. Jonah staggered back, dropping the key with a gasp, watching as it rolled to the floor. His pulse raced, his vision blurred. He wasn't sure if the room was really shaking, or if it was just his mind unraveling under the weight of his fear. But then he heard it. Something that sent an icy thrill running through his veins. A voice, low and heavy, calling from deep within the apartment. Jonah. The voice was unmistakable, deep and resonant, reverberating in his bones. But it wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't anyone he recognized. It was the voice of something ancient. Something that had been lurking beneath the surface of the world, waiting to be awakened. Something that now knew his name. Jonah stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, to leave before it was too late, but his legs wouldn't obey. The voice, growing stronger, began to speak again, but its words were like acid, corroding his sanity. You took it, Jonah. You agreed. And now, you will pay. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing, twisting, morphing into shapes that defied logic. Figures, humanoid and misshapen, loomed in the corners, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, watching him with malicious intent. His skin prickled with the sensation that something was crawling beneath it. A whispering wind picked up, its chill cutting through him, as if it were made of something far colder than air. Jonah's mind was unraveling. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, so loud it was a roar, drowning out everything else. He tried to run, tried to move, but his body betrayed him. His feet were rooted to the floor, as though the very foundation of the apartment had become a part of him. Jonah! The voice again, a cold and familiar whisper. It was coming from behind him. Slowly, he turned. His breath hitched in his throat as he saw her, Sarah. But it wasn't the Sarah he had known. This figure standing just beyond the threshold of the room was not the woman he remembered. Her face was blank, hollow, as if the life had been drained from her. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, their pupils dilated in a way that made Jonah's stomach twist in revulsion. Sarah? Jonah whispered, his voice trembling, weak with fear. But Sarah, or whatever this thing was, didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her lips stretched into a thin, unnatural smile that didn't belong on a human face. Then she moved. It wasn't the kind of movement a living person made. It was jerky, spasmodic, as if her limbs were being controlled by some unseen force. Her head tilted unnaturally, cracking like bones shifting beneath her skin. Jonah tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his body frozen in place as the figure of Sarah continued to advance, her smile widening, stretching impossibly wide. Her lips peeled back, revealing rows of teeth that were far too many, far too sharp. You shouldn't have taken it, Jonah, she repeated, her voice not quite Sarah's but something darker, a twisted echo of her tone. Now it's too late. Jonah's mind was a blur of panic, his thoughts scattering like paper in the wind. His feet finally found movement, and he bolted toward the door, but it slammed shut in front of him with a force that shook the apartment. His hands fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to press in on him, closing the room tighter, suffocating him with each passing second. He turned to face Sarah again, his eyes wide with terror. The figure of Sarah was closer now, her eyes gleaming with malevolent joy. She was laughing, but the sound was hollow, like a corpse rattling with its last breath. Don't try to escape, Jonah, the voice crooned. You made a promise. You belong to it now. Jonah's head spun. What did it mean? The promise? What was she talking about? He hadn't made any promises, at least not any he could remember. But then his mind flashed back to that moment when he had first touched the key. The overwhelming sense of obligation, the whispering in his ear, the darkness that had descended upon him as soon as his fingers had brushed the metal, the feeling that he had crossed a line, sealed an agreement with something that had no mercy, no compassion. You can't run from it, the voice of Sarah hissed, the shadows in the room deepening. It owns you now. The room felt smaller, darker. Jonah's breath was coming in sharp, shallow gasps. He was trapped, suffocating in a nightmare that had no end. The shadows were closing in, wrapping around him like tendrils, and no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't escape. He was alone in this room, and whatever was in the dark had already claimed him. Then, from the corner of the room, Jonah heard it. The faintest, almost imperceptible click. The key that had started it all. It lay on the ground in the corner, untouched by him, as though it had been waiting for him to return to it. Jonah took one last desperate step toward the key, but his body gave way. His legs folding beneath him, he collapsed to the ground, the darkness rising to meet him. The last thing he saw was the twisted figure of Sarah grinning at him, her face distorting into something grotesque. And then, nothing. Chapter 4. The Echo of Silence. Part 2. Jonah's chest heaved as his breath caught in his throat, a sharp, suffocating feeling clamping down on him. He didn't know what was worse, the silence or the oppressive weight of the shadows closing in. His skin felt cold, slick with sweat as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The air around him felt alive, thick with something unseen, pressing against him from every direction. The darkness was no longer just a void but a presence, wrapping itself around him, slowly squeezing the very life out of his lungs. He couldn't move. He could only stare at the spot where Sarah had stood, now empty. The echoes of her distorted voice lingering in the silence. He had no idea how long he had been lying there on the cold floor, paralyzed by fear, by the crushing weight of something he couldn't comprehend. The key, still lying in the corner, seemed to glimmer in the faint flickering light. It wasn't just an object anymore. It had become a symbol, a twisted representation of his fate. The cold metal seemed to beckon him, a siren's call that he couldn't resist. It felt like it was calling him home, as if it had always been meant for him, as if he had never had a choice in the matter. And yet, the more he stared at it, the more its presence made his stomach churn. "Jonah," a voice whispered again, but this time, it wasn't Sarah's voice. No, this voice was deeper, older, as though it came from the very walls themselves. It was low and guttural, vibrating in his chest. "You made a promise, didn't you?" His head shot up, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs. He could feel the weight of those words hanging in the air, a promise he couldn't remember making, but one that somehow felt like it had always been his to keep. His mouth went dry, his tongue heavy in his mouth as he tried to respond, but no words came. There was only the heavy, rhythmic pounding of his own heartbeat, echoing in his ears. The voice continued, its cadence slow and deliberate, as though savoring each word. "Promises are not meant to be broken. You belong to it now, Jonah. You always have." A low, rumbling sound filled the room. Jonah felt the floor tremble beneath him. The shadows seemed to stretch, moving of their own accord, wrapping around him like the tightening coils of a serpent. He could feel the walls closing in, the space around him growing smaller, more suffocating. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. It was as though the very apartment itself had become a trap, an inescapable prison that fed off his fear. Then, the whispering returned, louder this time, coming from all directions. Thousands of voices, layered on top of each other, murmuring unintelligible words. They rose and fell like a chorus, a cacophony of anguish and longing, their whispers clawing at his mind. Jonah closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound, trying to stop his head from spinning. But it was no use. The voices didn't stop. Instead, they grew clearer, more distinct, each one echoing in his mind, as though the very thoughts he tried to banish were being dragged from the deepest recesses of his soul. "Jonah." It was Sarah's voice again, but twisted, mangled, like something decayed. His heart froze. "You can't run from this. You can't hide from it. You belong to it, Jonah. You promised." Jonah's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he forced himself to his feet. Every movement felt heavy, unnatural, as though his body were made of stone. His legs wobbled beneath him as he staggered toward the corner where the key lay. He couldn't help it. His hand reached out for it, trembling, as if an unseen force had guided it there. As soon as his fingers touched the cool metal, an electric shock ran through his body. The world around him seemed to dissolve. For a moment, everything went black. When Jonah opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the apartment. He wasn't even sure where he was anymore. His surroundings were different, unfamiliar. A vast, empty space that stretched out into infinity. The air was thick with a low, oppressive hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate through his bones, making everything feel wrong. The very ground beneath him felt unstable, like it was shifting, moving, alive. The shadows here were alive too, stretching across the landscape like dark veins, twisting and turning with a life of their own. They reached toward him, as though trying to pull him in. He stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The key was still clutched tightly in his hand, its metal cold against his palm, and somehow, despite everything, he knew that it had brought him here. A figure appeared before him, emerging from the darkness like a shadow made flesh. It was tall, impossibly tall, with features that were distorted, stretched beyond recognition. Its face was a blur of flickering images, shifting from one form to another, too fast for him to comprehend. But what struck him most were the eyes, two glowing hollow orbs that stared straight through him, into his very soul. "You've come," the figure said, its voice smooth and deep, like velvet being torn apart. "The key has chosen you." Jonah opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, his body trembling with an overwhelming sense of dread. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. "You have broken the promise, Jonah," the figure continued, its voice growing colder, more venomous. "You took the key. You entered the pact." Jonah felt the weight of those words settle over him, like chains around his heart. A pact? What pact? He hadn't agreed to anything. He had simply found the key, that was all. But as the figure spoke, images flashed in his mind. Fragments of memories he hadn't known he had. Moments that felt so distant, yet so familiar. He saw a shadowy figure standing over him, whispering to him in a voice that echoed like a distant thunderstorm. "Take the key," the figure whispered, its voice cold and commanding. "Embrace your fate. It is your destiny." The memory was fleeting, slipping through his fingers like smoke. But one thing was clear. He had been marked, chosen. The key had chosen him, and now he couldn't escape. The figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating, and Jonah instinctively took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure smiled, or rather, its face stretched into a shape that vaguely resembled a smile. It was the smile of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. "You belong to it now," it murmured, the words dripping with malice. "Your soul is forfeit." Jonah wanted to scream, to run, but the air was thick with an oppressive weight that made it impossible to move. The shadows surrounded him, closing in from all sides, until the figure was all he could see. The key pulsed in his hand, thrumming with a life of its own, and then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure was gone. The darkness too dissipated, and Jonah found himself standing alone in the empty void. The only thing that remained was the key and the promise. Chapter 5. The Bound Threads. Jonah's eyes snapped open, and for a moment he wasn't sure where he was. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of the dark void still clung to him like a wet shroud, and his body, drenched in cold sweat, seemed to ache from every angle. The air around him felt dense, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. He was no longer standing in the strange, shadow-filled realm, but he didn't feel as though he had truly escaped either. The apartment, his apartment, felt unfamiliar now. The walls, once an intimate cocoon, now seemed to stretch and warp, pulsating with an unsettling life of their own. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as the whispers began again, soft at first, then growing louder and clearer, until they reverberated in his skull. "Jonah, you cannot escape." The voice was everywhere. It was within him, gnawing at his mind. His body was tense, his skin crawling with the weight of something, someone watching him, waiting for him to act. He tried to move, to get up from the bed, but it felt like the very air around him had become thick, resistant to his will. His body remained rooted to the mattress, his limbs heavy with an unnatural weight. Then the whispers grew into words. The promise must be kept. Jonah squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but they were relentless, flooding his mind with memories, flashes of the moments when he first touched the key, the shadowy figure that had appeared in his dreams, the curse that had taken root in his soul. The images were fragmented, like broken glass scattered across his consciousness, yet they were sharp, cutting into him with painful clarity. And then he heard it. A soft knock at the door. At first, Jonah thought it was another trick of his mind, some cruel hallucination, but the sound came again, faint but real. Someone was knocking at his door. His heart pounded, panic flooding his veins. He didn't want to answer it. He couldn't. Not when everything felt so wrong. Not when the shadows seemed to press against the walls, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The knocking continued, persistent, like a beat of some dark ritual. It wouldn't stop. Jonah pushed himself out of bed, his limbs heavy and stiff. His legs felt unsteady, like they couldn't hold him, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. The door had become a threshold, a point of no return. He had to face it. With trembling hands, he opened the door, and standing there, in the threshold of the dimly lit apartment, was Sarah. But she wasn't Sarah, not anymore. Her appearance had changed. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, were now dull, sunken, like two deep pools of darkness. Her skin had taken on a sickly pallor, and her mouth was stretched into a grim smile that made her look wrong. Her lips were cracked, dry, and her breath came in shallow, raspy gasps. She stepped forward into the room, the shadows around her swirling like tendrils of smoke. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice hollow, distant, like a memory slipping through his fingers. "You've been so careless." Jonah's throat constricted, his body recoiling from her presence. This wasn't Sarah. It couldn't be. It was a twisted reflection, a hollow mockery of the person he had once known. The thing that stood before him wasn't human. It was something darker, something that had come through the door he had opened, the door that had never truly been closed. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by the nightmare that had come to life before him. His mind screamed at him to move, but the shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, closing in on him like a vice. "Why did you take it, Jonah?" Sarah's voice was a low rasp now, almost guttural, as if it were no longer hers at all. "Why did you make the promise? You can never break it now. You can never leave." Jonah staggered backward, his chest tightening as he felt the oppressive weight of the room pressing down on him. He needed to understand. He needed to know what was happening, why everything was falling apart. "What do you want from me?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah's grin widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth where once there had been nothing but normal, human ones. "I want what was promised. I want what is mine." And then it hit him. The promise, the key, the shadowy figure. He hadn't just taken the key, he had taken the burden. And now the burden was claiming him, piece by piece, pulling him into something deeper, something darker than he could ever have imagined. But it wasn't just Sarah, was it? The entity, the force that had taken hold of her, was ancient, bound by some unspoken law, some contract that had been formed long ago. And now, Jonah had unwittingly become part of that contract. The key had marked him, and the promise he had made was like a chain, dragging him deeper into the darkness with every passing moment. "You belong to it now," Sarah whispered, her voice soft and insistent, like a lullaby sung by something not quite human. "The key has claimed you, and now you must keep your word, or it will take everything." The room grew colder, the shadows deepening further. Jonah felt himself being pulled into the suffocating darkness, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. His heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears, drowning out everything else. But the shadows were not just closing in, they were changing. The very air was shifting, warping into something monstrous. Jonah could see it now. Figures, shadowy, indistinct. But there, they crowded in on him, closing the space between them until there was no air left to breathe. "Please," Jonah gasped, his breath ragged. "I didn't mean it. I didn't—" The shadows seemed to laugh, the sound reverberating through his mind like 1,000 whispers. They were laughing at him, mocking him. "You can't take it back now, Jonah," the voice of Sarah said. But now it was joined by a chorus, a cacophony of voices, all whispering in unison. The promise is made, and the price must be paid. Jonah fell to his knees, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He felt the life draining from him, his very soul being tugged at, pulled into the abyss. The shadows danced around him, whispering promises of endless suffering and despair. Then suddenly the voices stopped. Jonah's breath hitched. The world around him seemed to pause, to hold its breath. In the silence that followed, Jonah heard the faintest sound, soft, like a breath on the wind, but distinct and clear. You are mine now, Jonah. Chapter 5. The Bound Threads. Part 2. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The whispering shadows surrounded him, tightening like a noose. The promise had been made. He could feel it now, deep within his chest, an unbreakable bond that stretched from his heart to the void, tying him to something ancient, something far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. It had all started so innocently. The key, the bargain, the strange figure in the darkness. But now it had come alive. It had teeth. It had claws. You are mine now, Jonah, the voice echoed. And though it was Sarah's voice, it was twisted, deformed and laden with something unearthly. Your soul, your body, your very essence, all belong to me. Jonah's heart thundered in his chest as he tried to move, to escape, but his legs were frozen in place. The shadows pressed in on him, suffocating him, blotting out all light. The air grew colder, colder than it had ever been, until the chill cut through his skin like 1,000 sharp blades. He wanted to scream, he wanted to run, to fight, but his mouth was dry and his limbs wouldn't obey him. He was trapped, not just in his apartment, but in something far worse, something beyond his understanding. The very fabric of reality itself seemed to be warping around him, stretching and folding like a piece of cloth being torn from the seams. Behind him, Sarah stepped forward, the light from the flickering bulb casting a sickly glow on her grotesque form. Her face, his face, was a mask of twisted mockery, a caricature of the woman he once knew. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and love, were now black pools, hollow and empty, staring into him as if she could see every secret he had ever kept. I've waited so long for you, Jonah, she crooned, her voice dripping with malice. So long, for you to realize the price of your decision. But now, you see, there is no escape. Jonah's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His thoughts raced, his mind scrambling for a way out, a way to break free from the chains of this nightmare. But the shadows closed in, tightening their grip, pulling him down deeper into the abyss. The room seemed to expand and contract, breathing in time with Jonah's panicked gasps. The air was thick, cloying, as if it were filled with the weight of forgotten memories. The darkness didn't just encircle him. It spoke to him, whispered secrets of the things that lurked beneath the surface of reality, of the forces that had always been there, hiding just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. He closed his eyes, trying to shut it out, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a roar, filling his head with a cacophony of voices. The promise must be kept. The bargain is eternal. All debts are paid in blood. Jonah pressed his hands against his ears, trying to block out the maddening voices, but they only grew louder, sharper, more demanding. And then, as if on cue, the darkness shifted. The room, once solid and familiar, now stretched impossibly. Jonah's apartment, the one he had lived in for years, was no longer just a space. It was a place of nothing, a black void. The walls had disappeared, leaving only an endless expanse of shadows and emptiness. The floor beneath him had dissolved into the abyss, and Jonah felt as though he were suspended in mid-air, surrounded by nothingness, trapped in a void of his own creation. And then the shadows began to take shape. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of his vision, a tendril of smoke creeping along the floor. But soon, the shadows coalesced into figures, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in black, their faces obscured by hoods, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jonah could feel them staring at him, could hear their breathing. They were everywhere, closing in, a circle of dark figures that surrounded him. He wanted to scream, but no sound came from his lips. He could barely breathe, barely move, as the coldness of their presence pressed against him, suffocating him. And then, one of the figures stepped forward. It was tall, impossibly tall, its long fingers reaching out to Jonah. It had no face, just an empty hood. But Jonah knew it was looking at him, at his soul. The creature's voice, if it could be called that, was like 1,000 whispers rolled into one. "You made the bargain, Jonah," the creature said, its voice seeping into his very bones. "You are ours now, and the price has come due." Jonah's heart sank. He understood now. The price was not just his soul. It was something far worse. These creatures, these things from the void, were bound to the promise he had made, and they would not release him. They would take from him everything, piece by piece, until nothing was left. The key, Jonah thought desperately. The key. I have to find a way to use it. There has to be a way out. But the figure's fingers touched his chest. And suddenly, Jonah felt something cold and sharp pierce through him. It wasn't physical. It was deeper, more insidious. It felt like it was burrowing into his very essence, pulling at the fibers of his soul. His body convulsed, and his vision blurred. He gasped for air, but the breath didn't come. "You cannot escape, Jonah," the voice whispered. "You never could." The pain intensified, and Jonah screamed. No sound left his lips, but the agony was real. His body trembled uncontrollably as the dark figure's hand pressed harder against his chest, twisting, tightening, until he thought he would break. He was drowning in the blackness, sinking into an abyss from which there would be no return. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the pressure vanished. Jonah gasped for breath, falling to the ground, his hands clutching at the air as if trying to grasp something solid, something real. The shadows receded, pulling back into the corners of the room, vanishing like smoke in the wind. He was alone. No more figures, no more whispers, no more cold, suffocating presence. But the room felt different now. The walls were still gone, and Jonah realized that the space he was in wasn't just empty. It was wrong. The air was thick, the silence oppressive. He could feel the weight of it all, pressing down on him from every direction. The shadows had left, but they hadn't gone far. They were watching, waiting. Jonah's body shook with fear, but he knew there was no going back. The promise had been made, and now there was only one thing left to do. He had to keep it. Chapter 6. The Hollowing. Jonah's pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of the silence. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the space around him had taken on a life of its own. The walls, which had once been so familiar, had now become a distant memory, replaced by the dark void in which he floated. Disoriented, he could no longer hear his own heartbeat in the eerie stillness, and the absence of sound only heightened the tension, drawing him deeper into the abyss. He stood on trembling legs, his body exhausted from the weight of the darkness pressing in around him. Every instinct told him to run, to escape, but there was no escape. The shadows had left, but they hadn't truly gone. They lingered in the edges of his consciousness, watching him with unseen eyes. Jonah could feel their presence, an invisible pressure that hovered just beyond his peripheral vision. They were still there, still waiting. The key that had once seemed like the answer, burned in his pocket. He could feel its heat against his skin, a constant reminder of the bargain he had made. It was the only thing that had connected him to the world he once knew, and yet it now felt like a weight, a heavy chain binding him to something far darker. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Jonah whispered, his voice thin and cracked. The words seemed to vanish into the void, swallowed by the darkness. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself, trying to steady the frantic beating of his heart. But every breath he took felt hollow, like it was not his own. The air was tainted, somehow wrong. It smelled faintly of decay, of old things forgotten and left to rot in the corners of the universe. Suddenly, a sound, soft at first, like a low murmur, but then growing louder, more distinct, cut through the silence. It was a voice. No, not a voice, but many voices, layered on top of one another, whispering from all directions, "Come closer." The words slithered into Jonah's mind like a snake coiling around his thoughts. "Come closer, Jonah." He tried to shake it off, to ignore the growing sense of dread that gripped him, but it was impossible. His body moved of its own accord, taking slow, hesitant steps forward. His feet dragged against the unseen ground, and his limbs felt heavy, as though some force beyond his control was pulling him deeper into the darkness. Each step took him further away from the place he had once known, the world he had once inhabited. He couldn't remember how long he had been standing here, alone in this endless void. The line between time and space had dissolved, leaving him suspended in a world that no longer made sense. The whispers continued to call him, their voices growing louder with each passing moment, until they filled his mind completely, drowning out everything else. They came from every direction, inside his head, outside his body, as if they were seeping into him, becoming a part of him. "You are ours now, Jonah. The promise is eternal." Jonah's heart lurched, and his hand flew to his chest, clutching at the spot where he could feel something cold and alien pressing against his ribs. The bond, the curse, was stronger than ever now. The shadows had marked him, and there was no escaping it. "You cannot escape, Jonah," the voices hissed in unison. "You will join us in the dark, where nothing lives but the hollowing, the place where promises are kept. Forever." His legs gave way, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His vision blurred as the world around him seemed to tilt and warp. The darkness was consuming him, pulling him down into the very depths of despair. He tried to fight it, tried to scream, but the words lodged in his throat, choking him from the inside. The promise, the bargain, they were all too real now, too close. Jonah had sealed his fate the moment he accepted the key, and there was no way back. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, it was nothing more than a faint shape, like a silhouette in the corner of his vision. But then it stepped into the pale light that seemed to emanate from nowhere, and Jonah's breath caught in his throat. It was Sarah. No, it wasn't. Not exactly. This being, looked like Sarah, but there was something wrong with it. Its eyes were wide and black, devoid of any emotion or recognition. The features of its face were pale and stretched, like a mask made from death itself. Its mouth hung open in a twisted smile, but it was not a smile of joy or happiness. It was the kind of smile that only exists in nightmares, hungry, predatory, and full of malice. "Sarah," Jonah croaked, his voice trembling with fear. The figure, Sarah, or what had once been Sarah, stepped forward, her movements jerky, unnatural. She didn't speak, but the voice, those haunting whispers, continued to echo around him, filling his mind with their inescapable cadence. "Join us, Jonah." Her hand reached out, fingers elongated, sharp as claws, brushing against his cheek in a gesture that should have been comforting. But Jonah recoiled instinctively, his skin crawling as if the touch were burning him. "You wanted to know what it felt like," Sarah's voice whispered, though her mouth did not move. It came from all around him, a sound that reverberated through his skull. "You wanted to know what it felt like to be free from the ordinary, to feel the power of the unknown. You wanted to feel alive." Jonah's vision spun, and the world around him seemed to dissolve into nothingness. The figure before him was all that remained, the twisted semblance of Sarah, her face now a mask of agony, her mouth gaping open in silent screams. He could feel it now, deep inside his chest, the hollowing, the emptiness. It had already begun. "Please," Jonah whimpered, desperate for some kind of mercy. "What do you want from me? What do I have to do?" The figure only smiled, that same horrible, empty smile. "You've already done it, Jonah. You've already given us everything." Jonah's pulse raced as the darkness closed in on him once more, his body falling into an endless descent. He couldn't escape. There was no more fight left in him. He had sealed his fate when he had made the promise, and now the void was taking him. He was no longer Jonah. He was something else entirely, a hollow, a vessel, a promise. And as the shadows swallowed him whole, the only thing he could hear was the whisper, "You will be ours. Forever." Chapter 7. The Fraying of Sanity. Jonah's mind was no longer his own. It had shattered, fractured, into countless jagged pieces that refused to settle, each one slipping into places they shouldn't be, tangled together in a web of confusion and torment. His thoughts raced, colliding against each other in a maelstrom of images and sensations, none of them making sense. The world around him had become a grotesque distortion, where reality itself had bent and twisted into a shape too monstrous to comprehend. The darkness had always been there, but now it was something more. It had weight, substance. He could feel it pressing against him from all sides, pulling at his limbs, suffocating him in its relentless embrace. It was as though the air had thickened, each breath he took growing heavier, more suffocating. The walls of the room, or what had once been a room, had disappeared, leaving only an endless void that stretched in every direction, like a chasm that swallowed all light and hope. A low, guttural hum filled the space, a sound that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It vibrated deep in Jonah's chest, causing his teeth to rattle in his skull. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, an entity, lurking just outside his perception, watching him, waiting. He tried to move, but his legs felt like stone, heavy and unyielding. His body was no longer his own. It was something alien, something that had long been detached from the person he used to be. The promise, the curse, was taking root inside him, spreading through his veins like poison, each drop weakening his resolve. But it wasn't just his body that was being consumed. It was his mind too. His thoughts, once sharp and clear, were now fraying at the edges, unraveling into madness. Images, memories, and half-formed dreams bled together into one indistinguishable nightmare. He saw Sarah, her eyes empty, her face a mask of horror, her twisted form reaching out to him, beckoning him deeper into the darkness. He could hear her voice, but it was no longer the comforting sound of someone he once loved. It was distorted, garbled, like the voice of something long dead. "Jonah," the voice whispered, slithering through the air, curling around him like a serpent. "Jonah, you cannot escape. You've already given yourself to us. There is nothing left for you but the hollow." His chest tightened, a wave of dread crashing over him. The word hollow reverberated in his skull, echoing in his ears. It was a promise, a curse. He could feel it now, deep within his soul. The hollowing was not just a transformation of the body, it was a destruction of the self. Everything that made him human, everything that made him Jonah, was being drained away, piece by piece. His hands trembled, and he looked down at them, watching in horror as they seemed to grow thinner, paler. The veins beneath his skin stood out, dark and twisted, like roots from some malignant tree, creeping under his flesh, taking hold. His fingers twitched, almost involuntarily, as if something inside him was urging him to do something, to reach out, to grasp something. But there was nothing. Nothing except the emptiness. "You will become us, Jonah," the voice continued, its tone soothing, almost maternal, as if it were trying to comfort him. "You will join the others. You will be eternal. The hollow will make you whole again." Jonah's mind reeled at the thought. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted to give in to the darkness, to the voices that called out to him, to the promise that had bound him so tightly. And yet, here he was, trapped, unable to escape, unable to stop the inevitable march toward his own undoing. He staggered backward, his feet slipping on the unseen ground, and fell into a cold, wet puddle. The chill sank into his bones, but he didn't move. He couldn't. His body refused to obey him, as if it had given up long ago. All he could do was lie there, trembling, staring up into the vast empty nothingness that surrounded him. A sound, a shift. Something moved in the darkness. He wasn't alone. Jonah's heart slammed against his ribcage, and he turned his head, straining to see. But there was nothing, nothing but the crushing blackness. He could feel it, though. A presence, close. So close he could almost feel its breath on his skin, cool and heavy with the stench of decay. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was her again, Sarah, but not the Sarah he had known. This Sarah had been changed, twisted. Her form was distorted, her body contorted in ways that made Jonah's stomach churn. Her eyes, those once warm eyes, were now black, empty voids, like two pits that led straight into hell. Her mouth hung open, but it wasn't the soft, welcoming smile he remembered. It was a grin, stretched wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. She reached out toward him, her fingers long and slender, but they didn't move in a natural way. They bent and flexed like something unholy, as if her bones had become brittle, snapping and reshaping with every movement. Jonah could feel his breath catch in his throat as she leaned in, close enough that he could smell the rot emanating from her. Jonah. Her voice was a soft hiss, like the rustling of leaves in a forgotten cemetery. Don't fight it. It's already inside you. You can't outrun us. Her words sliced through his chest like a blade, leaving a trail of cold, desolate emptiness in their wake. Jonah's hands shook violently, and he instinctively reached for his chest, where his heart felt like it was being torn apart. The hollowing had begun. It had already started. He could feel it now, deep inside, a gnawing emptiness that was spreading through him, devouring him from within. Join us, Jonah. The hollow is your destiny. Sarah's lips curled into that grotesque smile, and her hand reached down to touch his face, her fingers cold and clammy. You will be like us. You will be eternal. Jonah's scream caught in his throat as her hand pressed against his cheek, her touch sending waves of nausea through his body. His mind, already fragile, cracked further under the weight of her touch. He tried to pull away, to escape, but it was useless. He was drowning, sinking deeper into the abyss that had no bottom. It's too late, Sarah whispered, her voice now a cacophony of whispers, all blending together, murmuring in unison. You cannot leave. You are ours now, forever. The world around him began to pulse, each beat matching the rhythm of his own failing heart. Jonah could feel the darkness consuming him, his vision narrowing until there was nothing left but the infinite blackness that pressed against his soul. The hollowing was complete. And then, with one final breath, Jonah ceased to exist. Chapter 7. Part 2. The hollowing. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonah's breath, once ragged and shallow, had become unnervingly calm. His chest, which had been heaving under the weight of his panic, now rose and fell with a steady mechanical rhythm. The world around him remained suspended in an oppressive stillness, yet the very air seemed to hum, vibrating with a malevolent energy that seemed to crawl beneath his skin. Every nerve, every fiber of his being screamed for release, for escape. But the knowledge that there was nowhere to go, nothing to do, crushed him with the weight of finality. Sarah's form lingered in his vision, that horrific mockery of the woman he once loved. She was no longer the Sarah he had known, the soft laughter, the gentle touch, the warmth of her presence. Those things had been consumed, twisted beyond recognition, swallowed up by the hollowing that was now spreading through him like wildfire. And in that moment, Jonah realized with cold clarity that he was already lost. There was no fight left in him, no strength to break free. The hollowing had begun, and it would not stop until there was nothing left but the void. Jonah! Her voice coiled around him again like a serpent, soft but full of malice. You were always meant to be here. This is where you belong. We have waited for you. He wanted to scream, to rail against the suffocating emptiness that was consuming his soul, but no sound emerged. His voice had been stolen, just like his will, like everything else that had made him human. His mouth moved, but only silence filled the space around him, suffocating him in a different kind of terror, the terror of knowing that even his voice had been swallowed by the dark. Sarah's grotesque grin widened. You are part of us now, Jonah, a piece of the whole. Don't you see? The hollow is not a curse, it's a gift, a chance to transcend the limits of flesh. We are eternal now, we are free. Jonah's mind screamed in rebellion. No, he thought desperately, but it was a feeble, fleeting resistance. His hands trembled uncontrollably, as if his body had become nothing more than a vessel for some dark power beyond his control. He felt a shift, a pressure building around him, a tightening of the space that felt so unnatural it was as though the very air had turned to stone. The shadows, thick and oppressive, seemed to pulse with a rhythm, like a heart beating in the distance. The darkness was alive, breathing, and Jonah was its prisoner. The ground beneath him began to shift. His body, no longer his own, moved as if guided by invisible strings, dragged forward by the unseen force that had already claimed him. His legs, stiff and unfeeling, shuffled forward in a slow, deliberate march. He couldn't stop it. There was no escape. With every step, Jonah felt something inside him wither. His heart, once so full of hope, seemed to shrink, to lose its pulse, as if it were turning to dust within his chest. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling in unnatural directions, cracking and snapping like brittle twigs under the pressure. He glanced upward, desperate to find something, anything that could break the spell. But all he saw was more of the same. Endless void. The same crushing darkness that seemed to extend without end. His gaze caught on something in the distance. Something moving. Something alive. At first, it was only a blur, a shifting shadow in the farthest corner of his vision. But as it drew closer, Jonah felt his blood run cold. It was another figure, one far more twisted than Sarah. The shape was wrong, grotesque in its very form. The limbs were elongated, the body contorted, like it had been sewn together from the remnants of broken souls. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the darkness, vibrating the very air. Jonah tried to move, to run, but his legs betrayed him, locked in place by an invisible force. He was forced to witness the thing, the creature, drawing nearer. "You think you're special, Jonah?" The creature hissed, its voice wet and slimy, like something scraped from the bottom of the ocean. "You think you can fight it? You think you can outrun what is inside you? The hollow calls to all, and now it has called to you." Jonah's vision blurred as the creature loomed over him, its face, if you could even call it a face, twisted into a grotesque parody of human expression. Its eyes were black pits, devoid of life, but they burned into his very soul with a malevolent intensity. Its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with jagged teeth, each one glinting like shards of broken glass. A foul stench poured from its skin, the scent of rot and decay, of death itself. Jonah tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. His lips trembled, but no words came. The creature's grin widened as it saw Jonah's futile attempt. "You are nothing but a vessel now, Jonah," it whispered, its voice crawling under his skin. "A hollow shell. And when the hollow consumes you, you will understand. There is no escape. You will become one of us." The world around Jonah shifted again, and he felt the pull of something deep within him, a tearing sensation, like his very soul was being shredded. The pain was excruciating, worse than anything he had ever known. It was as if his insides were being hollowed out, leaving only an empty shell behind. He screamed in agony, but still no sound escaped. The creature stepped forward, its long, bony fingers reaching for him. Jonah tried to back away, but his body refused to move, locked in place by the growing power of the hollow. The shadows closed in, wrapping around him, suffocating him. "Don't you understand, Jonah?" the creature whispered, its voice soft, almost tender now. "You are the hollow. You always have been." Jonah's eyes snapped open in horror. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him, drowning him in its enormity. He was the hollow. He had always been the hollow. From the moment the darkness first called to him, from the moment he had made that cursed promise, he had sealed his own fate. He wasn't fighting the hollow. He was the hollow. A tear slid down his cheek, though it was no longer his own. His body was no longer a person. It was just a vessel, a collection of memories and whispers, a tool of the void. With a final, guttural scream that was drowned by the darkness, Jonah's mind shattered completely. The hollow had taken him, body and soul, and he could never return. The creature loomed over him, its twisted face the last thing he would ever see. "Welcome to eternity, Jonah. You are finally home." Chapter 8. The Unraveling. The world had become a blur, the line between the living and the dead no longer clear. Jonah's once solid body had become something other, no longer governed by the laws of the material world, no longer tethered to the fragile limits of flesh. He was a vessel, an empty husk, an echo of the man he had been. His mind, shattered and twisted, fought against the inevitable, but there was no escape from what he had become. The air around him buzzed with an unnatural energy, vibrating with the hum of something ancient, something forgotten, reaching back beyond time itself. His senses were heightened. Every whisper of wind, every rustle of shadow, sent a chill crawling down his spine. It was as if the very space around him was alive, watching, waiting. Jonah had no idea how much time had passed. It could have been minutes. It could have been years. Time had become irrelevant. He had entered the hollow, a place where time bent and twisted, where nothing could be trusted. The memories that had once defined him, his childhood, his love for Sarah, the laughter they shared, were dissolving, fading into a dark mist that clouded his thoughts. Everything that had made him human was slipping away. And yet, through the fog of his broken mind, one thing remained: the gnawing hunger. The hollow inside him, the void, was not content. It demanded more. It craved more. Jonah's heart, what little was left of it, beat with an unnatural rhythm, as though trying to stave off the emptiness. But the more he resisted, the more it grew. The hunger was not for food, not for flesh. It was for something far darker, something deeper, something alive. Jonah staggered forward, his legs moving on their own, the sensation of walking feeling like an impossible task. His feet dragged through the blackened, lifeless earth, leaving behind no mark. He could hear his breath, shallow and rasping, as if the air itself were becoming thinner, harder to draw in. The shadows grew thicker, more oppressive, as if they were closing in around him. The sky above, what little of it could be seen, was a sickly, mottled grey, swirling with unnatural clouds that twisted and coiled like monstrous serpents. There was no sun, no warmth, only a cold that gnawed at his bones and crept into his very soul. He stopped. The ground before him rippled like water, the surface warping and bending in ways that defied all logic. From within the shifting mass of blackness, a figure began to emerge, a silhouette, its features hidden beneath a cloak of shadows. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its form indistinct, shifting, as though it were made of darkness itself. Jonah's heart thudded painfully in his chest. A voice, cold and hollow, filled the air around him, crawling beneath his skin. "Do you see it now, Jonah?" He couldn't reply. His mouth felt numb, his throat tight with fear. His body, no longer his own, was frozen, unwilling to obey. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the force of the hollow. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer with each movement. A face slowly materialized from the swirling shadows, and Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he saw what it was. It was Sarah, but not Sarah, not the Sarah he had known. Her eyes were hollow, black voids where once there had been warmth and love. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, her features contorted in a way that made her unrecognizable, as if her very existence had been corrupted by the hollow. The skin on her face stretched unnaturally, her bones creaking under the pressure of an otherworldly force. "Sarah?" Jonah managed to whisper. Though the word felt foreign in his mouth, it felt like it didn't belong to him anymore. She tilted her head, her smile widening. "I am Sarah, and I am not Sarah," she whispered, her voice a mixture of honey and venom. "I am the hollow, and you will be too." Jonah stumbled back, his body reacting before his mind could comprehend. The hunger, the hollow, roared inside him, the void inside stretching, yearning. He could feel it. Sarah's touch, cold and suffocating, pulling at him from the depths of the void. "No," he croaked, "this isn't real." Her laugh echoed, a sound so dark, so empty, that it made Jonah's spine crawl. "It is more real than you could ever imagine. You were always a part of this, Jonah. You were always meant to be here. The hollow has always been inside you. waiting for the right moment to consume you. Jonah's legs buckled beneath him. He fell to his knees, the weight of her words crushing him. "I don't want this," he gasped, his voice a strangled sob. "Please, I don't want this." But Sarah, no, the thing that had once been Sarah, leaned in close, her hollow eyes boring into his soul. "You never had a choice, Jonah," she whispered. "None of us did." The air around him grew colder, the darkness deeper. The hollow, the void, was all-consuming. It stretched into the corners of his mind, devouring his thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self. Jonah could feel it, creeping into the spaces between his thoughts, slithering through his veins like poison. The hunger, insatiable, filled every corner of his being, until there was nothing left of Jonah but the darkness that had claimed him. As he stared into Sarah's empty eyes, his body shaking, he realized the truth. There was no escape. The hollow had already won. And as his consciousness slipped away, as his very identity unraveled, Jonah felt the last remnants of his humanity fade into nothingness. He was lost. He had been lost from the beginning. And now, the hollow would claim him fully. The last thing he saw was Sarah's face, twisted, hollow, and empty. Her smile, once full of love, now a grotesque parody of that warmth, stretched wider and wider until it consumed everything. And then, there was nothing. Chapter 9. The cracking of reality. The darkness was absolute now. Jonah floated within it, suspended like a ghost trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. He no longer felt his own body, nor did he sense the passage of time. The air was thick with a suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional rustle, a whisper from the deepest corners of his mind. There was no escape. There had never been escape. The hollow, the thing that had once been Sarah, the thing that had been his own reflection, still lingered at the edges of his perception. Jonah could feel it, an ever-present weight pressing on his chest, as though it were trying to crush the very breath from his lungs. Yet no matter how hard he struggled to remember who he was, who he had been, the images slipped through his fingers like grains of sand, dissipating into the blackness. His thoughts were no longer his own. They felt like stolen fragments, broken pieces of some other consciousness, weaving themselves into his mind without his permission. Each passing moment was a battle for control, a futile attempt to claw his way back from the abyss. But the hollow was relentless. Jonah's mind cracked like a pane of glass under immense pressure. He had no sense of time, no sense of space. It felt like he was falling endlessly into a void that stretched beyond the very limits of existence. The sensations of his body had disappeared entirely, leaving him as little more than a drifting thought, an echo of a person who had once been real. All that remained was the feeling of the darkness, cold and hungry, curling around him like a serpent preparing to strike. Suddenly, a voice, his voice, whispered through the void. "You are nothing." It was a chilling thing to hear, his own voice tainted with a layer of emptiness, distorted beyond recognition. Jonah could feel the words reverberating through him, sinking deep into the marrow of his soul. He wanted to scream, to fight, but no sound came. The voice wasn't just in his ears, it was inside him, resonating from every corner of his fractured mind. The shadows around him pulsed, a rhythmic beat that seemed to echo the slowing of his thoughts. With each pulse, the darkness pressed closer, inching forward like a living thing, an entity that fed on his fear, his confusion. The hollow, Sarah, had spoken to him earlier, her voice a twisted mockery of the love he had once known. But now, it was not her he heard. It was something far worse. The hollow had no shape, no true form. It was not a thing that could be seen or touched. It was only felt. It was a presence, a pervading, consuming emptiness that wrapped itself around his soul, suffocating every shred of resistance he had left. Jonah's mind flickered back to the first time he had seen Sarah, the real Sarah, the woman he had loved. Her smile, warm and inviting, the way she had looked at him with such hope, such trust, as though nothing could ever tear them apart. But now, That warmth had turned to ashes. That trust had been shattered. The hollow had stolen everything, and Jonah had been too blind to see it. The faintest memory of her face, her real face, flashed before his eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by the dark, her features twisting into something grotesque, something alien. The love he had felt for her felt like a distant dream, one that was slipping further and further away with each passing moment. Was it ever real? Had it all been a lie? An illusion planted in his mind by something more ancient, more powerful than he could comprehend? He couldn't remember. "You're already gone," the voice whispered again, louder this time, reverberating against his skull. It sounded like his own thoughts, but somehow different, more mocking, more certain. Jonah felt the pressure in his chest grow. He wanted to scream, to claw at the walls of this suffocating emptiness, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to fight against. His body was no longer his own. His mind, once sharp, now felt brittle, as if it would crack into 1,000 jagged pieces if he pushed too hard. It was the hollow. It had always been the hollow. His own thoughts were turning against him, becoming part of it. Jonah realized, with a jolt of horror, that the hollow was not just a force that surrounded him. It was inside him. It had always been there, buried deep beneath the surface of his mind, waiting for the right moment to consume him whole. It had used his love for Sarah to pull him into this hell, to break him down piece by piece. His memories were fragmenting now, broken, shattered images of the past. Each piece felt like a puzzle that no longer fit together. Faces, places, words, all slipping away, dissolving into the blackness. The past felt like a fading dream, something that had never truly existed. And yet, the hollow was real. Jonah couldn't tell where his thoughts ended and the hollow began. They were merging, becoming one. He could feel it, a creeping, invasive sensation, like something crawling beneath his skin. He tried to focus, tried to hold on to the last vestiges of his identity, but the hollow was too strong. It pressed in on all sides, closing in, until there was no longer any room to breathe, to think. He felt the shift, that quiet, unnoticed fracture in the air, a crack in reality. Suddenly, Jonah was no longer alone. The shadows began to move, swirling around him, gathering into shapes, figures, faces that he had known. His mother, his father, Sarah. No, the thing that had been Sarah. All of them emerged from the darkness, their eyes wide and empty, staring at him as though they were lost, as though they had always been lost. They spoke without words. Their lips didn't move, but their thoughts, his thoughts, reached him with clarity. They had always been there, hidden in the dark corners of his mind. The hollow had always been part of him, and now it was showing him the truth. Jonah tried to scream again, but no sound came. He felt his chest constrict, the weight of the hollow pressing harder. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't escape. The figures began to circle him, their eyes filled with the same hollow emptiness that had consumed Sarah. Jonah could feel their coldness, the icy chill that seeped into his bones, dragging him deeper into the nothingness. There was no escape. "You are one of us now," they whispered, 1,000 voices merging into a single, unified sound. "You have always been one of us." Jonah's body shook, the last remnants of his will crumbling beneath the weight of their words. His identity, his humanity, was slipping away. He could feel it, the last pieces of himself being torn apart, consumed by the hollow. And then, there was nothing. The last flicker of Jonah's consciousness vanished into the dark. He was no more. Chapter 9. The Cracking of Reality, Part 2. Jonah drifted through the dark void, no longer a man but something else, something formless. He couldn't remember when the pain had stopped. It had felt like a violent tearing at first, like his soul was being shredded into threads, each one unraveling faster than he could comprehend. But that sensation was gone now, replaced with something worse, a deep emptiness, a void so vast it swallowed any sense of time, of self, of understanding. The figures surrounding him had stopped their incessant whispers, and in the dead silence that followed, Jonah felt something strange begin to creep into his thoughts, a feeling of completion. It wasn't satisfaction, nor relief. It wasn't even comfort. It was more like the moment when the last drop of water settles into the bottom of a well, filling the emptiness completely, sinking, settling, becoming part of the void. For the first time since he'd entered this nightmare, Jonah felt something akin to recognition. His mind, fractured and bent under the weight of the hollow, began to piece itself together. But the pieces weren't his own. They were something else, something alien. He knew the hollow was taking root in him, burrowing deeper into the recesses of his fractured soul. But something else stirred inside him now. A presence. Not Sarah, not his mother, not the spectres that had tormented him. This presence was colder, more ancient, an intelligence, vast and unknowable, reaching out with fingers of shadow to manipulate the remains of his consciousness. Jonah's body, or what was left of it, felt numb. The sensations long since evaporated into the blackness. But his thoughts, or what had once been his thoughts, were still moving, still clinging to the fading fragments of his existence. He could feel the hollow in his mind, like an invasive parasite, growing stronger with each passing moment. But then, something shifted. The blackness in front of him split, like an enormous tear in the fabric of reality itself. A thin line of light appeared, seeping through the void, growing wider. It was not the warmth of salvation. No, this light was cold, harsh, blinding, a stark contrast to the endless abyss that had been his prison. Jonah tried to turn away, to retreat back into the darkness that had once offered him the comfort of nothingness. But the light pulled at him with an unseen force. It wasn't just light. It was something more, something older, something that shouldn't exist. The presence in his mind stirred once again, this time more violently. Jonah could feel its reach, its tendrils of influence stretching outward, trying to keep him tethered to the hollow, to the nothingness. It was struggling, desperate, as though it feared the light itself. And then, from the light, a voice, a clear, crystalline voice, pierced the silence. It was a voice Jonah had heard before, once, faint and distant, like a memory half remembered. Jonah. Jonah. It was Sarah. Her voice was the last thing he wanted to hear, the last thing his fractured mind could bear. He had seen her, no, the hollow, masquerading as her. He had felt the rot, the corruption that had overtaken her. And now, even her voice felt tainted, poisoned by the same darkness that had consumed his soul. But the voice persisted, repeating his name over and over until it became a chant, a mantra, drowning out the dissonant whispers of the hollow. The rhythm of it, the cadence, was hypnotic, like the sound of a heartbeat, steady and insistent. Jonah, come back. The words tugged at something deep inside him, like a hidden memory buried in the recesses of his mind. He could feel a fleeting connection, like a rope being thrown to him in the dark. It was a lifeline, but he knew better than to trust it. The hollow was still there, pressing against him, its grip tightening around his thoughts like a vice. But this new force, this voice, was different. It was pushing against the darkness, pulling him towards something other. Please, Jonah, remember me. Jonah wanted to scream, to shut the voice out, but the words, Sarah's words, seeped into his very core. The light pulsed now, brighter, warmer, as though it could cleanse him, purify him from the inside out. He saw her again, her face floating just beyond the reach of the light, half-formed, obscured by the shadows that still clung to the edges of his mind. Sarah's face, just like it had been before the hollow came. But there was something wrong, something not quite right about her smile. Her eyes gleamed with an unnatural shine, cold and empty. And yet, there was something there, something familiar. Jonah's heart raced. The hollow was still trying to claim him, but now there was a choice between the darkness and the light, between the creature that had taken Sarah and the woman he had once known. Jonah, come to me. It's not too late. You can be whole again. Her voice had taken on an almost pleading tone now, desperate, but Jonah felt something shift in him, a connection, a fragile tether, was pulling him toward her. For a moment, he thought he could feel her fingers brushing against his own, as though she were reaching out to him. But then, like a violent storm breaking the calm, the hollow screamed. A shrill, guttural sound that reverberated through Jonah's very being. It wasn't just an external force anymore. It was inside him. It had always been inside him. Its voice mingled with Sarah's, becoming one, overlapping, twisting, like two people speaking the same words, but with different intentions. Jonah gasped as the coldness of the hollow surged through his veins. The warmth of Sarah's voice shattered, replaced by the deep, bone-chilling hunger of the thing that had taken her. It was trying to draw him in, to pull him back into its grasp. And then, he understood. The hollow wasn't Sarah. It wasn't a twisted version of her, nor was it some otherworldly force. It had always been there, buried in him, in his deepest fears, his darkest desires. The hollow wasn't something he could escape from. It was part of him, woven into the fabric of his soul. And just like that, Jonah's choice was gone. There was no escape, no salvation. There was only the hollow. The light flickered once, then dimmed. Jonah's last fleeting connection to the real world faded, and he was left alone again, drifting in the consuming darkness, a broken fragment of something once human. Chapter 10. The Final Witness. The hollow had consumed Jonah, but the world did not collapse. It did not end with the final death of a man. No, it continued, as it always would. A blink in time, an irreversible tear that would never fully heal. The forces that governed the universe, the unseen hands that manipulated the fragile strings of fate, had been waiting for this moment. The darkness within Jonah, once a whisper, had become a roar. It had become his reality. It whispered things to him now, things that were not his own thoughts, but things that had always been inside him. It promised him clarity, understanding, and with it came an unbearable truth. Jonah had never been a victim. He had always been the cause. For as long as he could remember, he had believed in the lie that he had lost everything, his family, his friends, his sanity. But the truth was far more twisted. They had never been lost. They had always been a part of him, bound to his soul, imprisoned by his own fractured mind. The hollow had fed on his grief, his regret, his rage, until it had become more than an entity. It had become Jonah. The thing that stood in the place of the man who once was him was now a mirror of his darkest desires, his deepest fears. There was no going back now, no escaping the hold of the hollow. Jonah had become its true form, not an external force, but an extension of his inner darkness. It had always been him, and now it was complete. But even in this new, terrifying existence, there was a flicker, a sliver of consciousness that remained unbroken, a final vestige of Jonah that still fought. It was weak, but it was there. The shadows within the hollow shifted. It had always been dark, an endless void of twisted thoughts and vile instincts. But now, as Jonah's awareness returned, the world around him shifted, warped by the echo of his fractured mind. Reality began to break apart, like glass shattering into 1,000 pieces, each piece reflecting a different version of himself, a different possibility, a different timeline. And with every crack, something, or someone, pushed through the darkness. He felt it first, a whisper, soft but insistent, threading its way through the cavernous pit of his mind. It was Sarah's voice, but not the voice that had come before, not the whisper that had drawn him into this hell. No, this voice was clearer, more defined, and despite the terror it carried, it sounded almost familiar. It carried warmth, like the comforting embrace of someone long forgotten, buried in the deepest recesses of his memories. Jonah! Her voice rippled through the void, her name like a prayer, a plea. Sarah was not gone. She couldn't be. The hollow had twisted her into a grotesque, monstrous thing, but the truth was undeniable. She was the last piece of humanity Jonah had left to cling to. Sarah! His voice came out hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years, choked by the weight of the darkness that surrounded him. But she did not respond immediately. Instead, the darkness shifted again, and Jonah found himself standing, not in the oppressive blackness of the hollow, but in a place that seemed familiar, yet foreign. He was standing in front of a house. It was not the house he had grown up in, nor was it the home he and Sarah had shared, but it felt like home, comforting, welcoming, like a place that had always existed in his memories, a place that could never be forgotten. The door creaked open on its own. A chill ran down Jonah's spine. He knew what he would find beyond the threshold. He could feel it, like a cold hand pressing against his chest. With every step he took toward the door, his heart beat harder, faster. He felt himself faltering, the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, threatening to pull him back into its abyss. But he couldn't stop. He had to know. He had to understand. Inside the house, the air was heavy with dust, with the weight of forgotten memories. The walls were adorned with photographs, pictures of his family, of Sarah, of people whose faces seemed unfamiliar yet achingly close. Time was irrelevant here. These images were both relics and prophecies, trapped in a world outside of reality, forever suspended in the in-between. He walked through the house, through rooms that had once been filled with life, now hollowed out and abandoned. It was a silent place, save for the faint creaks of the floorboards beneath his feet. He moved toward the back of the house, where he knew he would find the truth. The kitchen was where they had shared so many meals together, so many quiet evenings. The countertops were still covered with old dishes, half-finished meals, stale bread that hadn't been touched in years. But the light, the faint, flickering light, came from a small window at the far end of the room. Jonah turned toward it, but what he saw made his blood run cold. Standing in the window was a figure, but it wasn't Sarah. The figure was tall, almost skeletal, draped in a cloak of shadows, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Jonah froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the very air around him had been tainted by its existence. "Who are you?" Jonah's voice broke the silence, but it was weak, almost drowned out by the silence of the house. The figure did not answer. It simply stared, its hollow eyes locked onto his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then, like a sudden surge of energy, Jonah's mind cracked open. He understood. This figure, this thing, was not just a random shadow. It was the hollow itself, taking form in his deepest fears. He had thought that it had already taken Sarah. But no, it had been manipulating her, distorting her into something that he could no longer recognize. This figure was not a reflection of his past. It was the manifestation of his future, his fate, his inevitable end. It was the hollow in its most primal form, speaking to him through the eyes of his nightmares. And it was waiting for him to join it. Jonah took a step forward, but the figure raised a hand, gesturing for him to stop. In that moment, Jonah realized something. He was no longer just a witness to his own suffering. He was the cause. The hollow was him, and he was it. They were inseparable, bound together by the darkness that had been festering inside him for so long. "No," Jonah whispered, backing away from the figure. "I won't become you." But the figure only smiled, its face twisted and contorted, like 1,000 voices screaming in agony. The darkness around it deepened, thickened, until it was all Jonah could see. "Jonah," it said, its voice like 1,000 nails scraping against glass. "You've always been mine." And then the world around him shattered. Chapter 10, Part 2. The Unraveling. The walls crumbled around him like paper, disintegrating into fine dust that clung to his skin, choking him with its heaviness. Jonah could feel his heartbeat, slow at first, as if the world was holding its breath. But then it began to quicken, thudding in his chest like the frantic wings of a trapped bird. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt raw, like it had been torn apart by the very air itself. Everything was shifting. The room, the house, was no longer the sanctuary it had appeared to be. It had become something far darker. The figure before him, once a shadow in the corner of his mind, now loomed with a presence that felt suffocating. It wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving, slowly, methodically, like a predator drawing closer to its prey. The air around Jonah grew thick with an unnatural chill, a coldness that pierced deep into his bones. And then, with a sound like the scraping of broken glass against stone, the figure spoke again. Its voice was not Sarah's. It was something older, something deeper, a sound born from the depths of hell itself. The air around Jonah began to vibrate with its words. "You've always known, haven't you?" it rasped. "You knew what you were. You knew what you were meant to be. I've been here, waiting for you to see it, to understand the truth. And now you do." Jonah's pulse thundered in his ears, but despite the fear flooding through him, a small, defiant part of his mind held on. He wanted to run. He needed to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The house had dissolved into an endless void, an abyss that stretched far beyond the walls of his memories. The very fabric of time and space was breaking apart around him. There was no safety here, no sanctuary. "Stop it," Jonah gasped, his voice a weak echo of the anger he felt boiling inside him. "This is not real. None of this is real. You're not me. You're not—" The figure's twisted grin widened, a horrible, unnatural thing, full of teeth that shouldn't exist. "Oh, but I am. And you are me, Jonah. You've been me since the beginning. I've always been with you. Inside of you." The world seemed to shift violently, like the ground beneath Jonah's feet was pulling away. His body lurched forward, propelled by the overwhelming force of the figure's presence. He fell to his knees, his hands gripping the floor beneath him in desperation, his nails scraping against the cold, smooth surface. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, a suffocating wave that threatened to drown him. "Please, stop," Jonah whispered, his voice a broken prayer. He didn't know who he was pleading to. Was it the hollow? Was it himself? He couldn't tell anymore. The figure's laughter filled the air, harsh and guttural, vibrating in the very core of his being. "You don't understand, do you?" it crooned. "You never had a choice. You never could escape it. You were born for this, Jonah. This is your purpose. This is your fate." The darkness around him thickened. Jonah's vision blurred as the edges of reality began to fray. He could feel himself slipping, his consciousness being pulled away, his mind unraveling. The world around him began to dissolve, taking with it everything he had ever known. His family, his home, even his name. Everything faded into the shadows. And then, just as Jonah felt himself teetering on the edge of oblivion, a sudden violent wave of clarity washed over him. It was the whisper again, faint, but unmistakable. "Jonah." His breath caught. This voice was different. It wasn't the hollow. It wasn't the monstrous figure that stood before him. No, this voice was familiar, warm, a lifeline. "Sarah," Jonah croaked, his voice raw, barely a whisper. He blinked, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop moving. The darkness seemed to pause, waiting, holding its breath. Was she here? Was she still with him? A figure appeared in the distance, emerging from the thick fog of shadow and light. Jonah's heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. It was Sarah, standing just beyond the reach of the darkness, her face bathed in an ethereal light. Her eyes met his, filled with an expression he couldn't quite place, but there was no fear in them, only a quiet understanding, as though she had known all along what would happen. "Sarah," Jonah whispered again, but his voice trembled. "How? How are you here? How are you real?" She took a step forward, and the world seemed to respond. The darkness recoiled slightly, as if afraid of her presence, but the figure that had been tormenting him didn't retreat. It only watched, unmoving, its smile widening into something feral. "You're not real," Jonah said, his voice breaking. "You can't be—" But Sarah stepped closer, her footsteps soft and purposeful. The moment her hand touched his, Jonah felt an electric jolt run through his body. The sensation was overwhelming, filling him with warmth and light that cut through the darkness like a blade. "I'm real, Jonah," she said softly. "But not in the way you think. I am a part of you. You've always carried me with you." The figure, the hollow, shuddered, as if struck by a great force. Jonah's vision blurred again, but this time, it wasn't the disintegration of reality. It was a shift, a change in perception, as though the walls between him and the world outside were starting to dissolve. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the truth behind Sarah's words, glimpsed a fragment of the past, of the choices he had made, and the darkness that had always followed him. "No," Jonah whispered, shaking his head, as the truth began to settle in. This isn't the way it was supposed to end." Sarah's face softened, her eyes filled with sorrow. "This is how it was meant to be. You've always had the power to change it, Jonah, but only you can free yourself." The hollow's growl filled the air, furious and guttural. It reached out with shadowy tendrils, grasping for Jonah, pulling him back into its grasp. But Sarah's presence, like a beam of light cutting through the night, pushed back the shadows. "No!" Jonah gasped again, standing taller, finally finding the strength to resist. He had always known, deep down, that he was more than the darkness that had consumed him. He had been a part of it, but he was not it. He could fight it. He could escape. "No more!" Jonah shouted, his voice trembling but strong. "I won't let you take me. I won't become you." And as he spoke those words, something within him cracked open, something he had been holding onto for so long. The hollow screamed, an inhuman wail of fury as it began to unravel. But Jonah stood his ground, his mind clear now, the power of his will stronger than ever before. For the first time in years, he was free.